Comedy is a very hard thing to do. So many times comedy is really a balancing act between the quality of your actors and their chemistry, the quality of a script and the ideas contained therein. Not just scenes of comedy and funny dialogue, but the progression of a film. Does it flow together? Does it feel forced? Are the interactions genuine? How absurd is the film and how absurd is it meant to be? And when you go to a comedy, you do have a suspension of disbelief. But sometimes when a movie comes out, a comedy comes out, it can really resonate with you because it's funny, because it feels like something that you would experience. And sometimes films, when they come out, are also a product of their time. A lot of people will say that comedies from the 80s didn't age so well, and for the most part, yeah, they're right. Comedy changes with the time, it changes with the era, it changes not just with the people in charge of making the films, but the audience that watches them, and the audience responsible for giving those films money and encouraging similar films to be made in their wake. And seeing Booksmart this year was something that I found really, really special. It is a really, really good film, and most importantly, what it does is not just create a comedy that speaks to this time and this place and really resonate with this generation, or at least it did with me, but it doesn't call attention to its ideas and messages and its inclusiveness. And so at the end of the day, it's one of those movies that you really have to see to completely understand. And if that doesn't convince you, I got more.
I don't know what to say.
Now, Booksmart is the directorial debut of Olivia Wilde. She's been acting for a while, and I was surprised to see her coming in to direct this. And without a doubt, her chops as a director are immediately apparent. This is a movie that knows what it is, not just from a narrative perspective, but in terms of how the comedy is conceived, built up, and delivered. And so much of that has to do with the acting quality of Kaitlyn Dever and Beanie Feldstein, who play your two protagonists. But so much more than that is their chemistry together. And so much more to that is their chemistry with everybody else in the film. So many times, movies depend on that character, whether it's Zach Galifianakis in The Hangover, whether it's your kind of Fonzie character, somebody who really just stands out and is the heart and soul of your comedy because of how bizarre they are. And the typical formula is you've got your really crazy, out there, kooky character, and you've got your straight man across from them. In this movie, these characters are human because at times they're both the straight man and they're the comedy. And everything feels very organic in that sense. And to that perspective, I really can't speak highly enough of this movie. Another aspect is that these characters and these scenes flow in a way where each scene is funny in its own right. And they're especially funny not just in that vacuum, but because we know who those characters are. And while there are some returning gags and the progression of the story adds to certain comedic elements, you can just tell this is a film that they had fun writing and fun executing. And so, what is Booksmart? What is the story there? Well, the story is about two high school girls who are about to graduate and go off into the world in their separate directions. Kaitlyn Devers is a young girl who is planning to graduate and then go overseas for a while and do nonprofit work. Interesting in the movie is that she is a young lesbian protagonist, and the film doesn't really call much attention to that. As the film begins to build in the first 10 minutes or so, you definitely get that idea, but you're not sure if you're reading too far into it. And there's no moment where the film goes, by the way, she's a lesbian. Similarly, with Beanie Feldstein, she is, in the most respectful way possible, an overweight protagonist. And the film doesn't make her character, doesn't make those jokes, doesn't make that movie and her role in it dependent upon her being overweight. It's not about that. That's not the punch. And that's why I struggle with movies starring Rebel Wilson or some of Melissa McCarthy's roles. Just being a certain body type or having a certain characteristic is not inherently funny. That's not a person. That's a caricature. That's a one-dimensional individual. And that really punishes a film because it takes you out of it and it makes you think of them not as a person, but as a boring archetype. So right away, you've got two really interesting characters who have a lot going on in their lives, not just because of those characteristics, but because you're just seeing very real people existing. And what's great about this story is it has a simple premise. Both of them are ready to graduate, and especially Beanie Feldstein is really obsessed with her success and her plan for moving forward. And we've all known those kinds of people in life who really prioritize their grades, going off to college, what their plan is for life. And all of that is upended when they realize that all the people who were out partying while they were studying, well, they're not losers. They are also on a path to success. And again, that really humanizes those people. And yes, some of the side characters can be a little one-dimensional when it comes to their archetype. You know, some are kind of your stoner bro, some are kind of your just, sexually obsessed teenage boy. Some are your Jamie Kennedy, Malibu's Most Wanted-esque character. But throughout the film, there are moments of levity. And people who seem at first to be kind of dickish, over time progress and grow and build, and you get a three-dimensional picture of them. And that's just wonderful storytelling. And at the end of the day, the film is really about that growth, finding yourself. If you define yourself by success, what are you left with? Sure, you've got your success, but a well-executed plan is as good as the results. And if at the end of the day, you're retiring with all the money and the prestige of a job you planned out from when you were 18, all you really did was live 65 years to execute a plan. What else do you have? Who else do you have in your life? And this movie's about that. It's a coming-of-age story, not about sexuality, not necessarily about finding oneself metaphysically, but really figuring out your priorities in life, and that things happen pretty fast. And if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you might just miss it. And we talk about, obviously that's a Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference. When we look in the 80s, it was really a trend of films dealing with people trying to figure out whether they wanted to buy into the system or rebel. Or in the case of Risky Business, characters who were more straight-laced, really coming out of their comfort zone to do new things. One of my favorite teen comedies in the last 20 years would be like The Girl Next Door with Emile Hirsch. And that, similar to Risky Business, is a story about a character not unlike that found in Booksmart. Very smart, very driven, with a plan, who is forced outside of their comfort zone and has to grow. And along with him, the people in his life grow, develop, and encourage that by having enough range to their characters, to their roles, that he sort of by osmosis takes a little bit of everything from them, and they help to accentuate the scenes by adding just a different perspective, different elements of comedy. And this film does that. You have characters who at first do seem one-dimensional, but through their growth add a certain amount of sincerity to the comedic beats. And at the end of the day, comedy to me, it's two things. One, the biggest thing it's been missing is sincerity. It's been missing that human hook and appeal. And for all the people saying that Booksmart is something out of the ordinary, they're 100% right. Now, a lot of people say it's out of the ordinary because they'll talk about how it's a film about two female protagonists. Yes, that is a little different. Unfortunately, when people compare it to things, they immediately compare it to like Bridesmaids and things like that. And unfortunately, that's sort of a counterintuitive binning, right? I mean, you're saying that it's different and that it's a good thing that it's just a movie that's a comedy and not presented as a female comedy, but people will then unintuitively lump it in with other films that happen to star women. And that to me at least, sort of it defeats the purpose. You're not really making headway into the equality of these types of movies and roles when you then kind of create a weird subgenre saying like, oh, it's woman comedy. It's not. Bridesmaids is funny because there are human experiences there that we don't hear about a lot. We're used to dude-driven comedy. Booksmart is funny not because, oh, it's two women, but because they are really real and honest characters. And again, part of that goes back to the very earnest and well-thought-out direction by Olivia Wilde, who allows these characters range and growth and solid beats in scenes for their humor to be organic and funny, to the point where it feels almost improvised. It doesn't feel forced. The second thing that I think comedy is falling into, or has fallen into, is there was a period for a while where you saw a lot of comedies like Superbad. And I even talked about The Hangover earlier, and a lot of comedies like that were really just seeing how far they could push things. And what was funny was sort of defined by how far you could push the audience by making them uncomfortable without turning them off. And so for me, I enjoyed Superbad. I thought it was good, but I wouldn't really watch it again. To me, the scene, for instance, where they're slow dancing with the girl on her period and there's blood, it's like, it's a shock value joke. I mean, it's the same as a jump scare in a horror. Once I've already seen it, that joke is dead to me. But if you look at Risky Business, if you look at Girl Next Door, if you look at Night Shift, which is one of my favorite comedies, it always comes back to those characters that you like and you want to see succeed, and oftentimes their flaws are what make them idiosyncratic and therefore funny. All too often, comedies are just a vehicle for gags. You know, the film is really just secondary to, all right, how funny can we make this line? How interesting can we make these characters for jokey appeal? But Booksmart has moments of aesthetic beauty. I mean, there are some scenes in there that are just gorgeous. And when I talk about giving characters space to breathe, the movie doesn't feel long, but there are scenes that really downshift in comedy. They're really not trying to be hilarious, but they're earnest, they're genuine. And when you're rooting for a character and you have a sequence where you're not supposed to laugh, but you're supposed to just feel happy for them. You know, you're seeing them in their environment, you're seeing some growth or some excitement, and the whole movie is about them trying to figure out who they are and how they can fit in with this group that they've isolated themselves from. When they begin to accomplish that goal, you feel great. And the camera work in that gets at times dreamlike and gorgeous and just accentuates that idea. Again, it really is impressive storytelling from a debut director. At the end of the day, who would like this movie? Well, if you like teen comedies, this is a great one. There are moments of irreverence, but it doesn't go for shock humor. You've got really interesting characters all across the spectrum, and no characters really seem to be forgotten. Nobody's a throwaway. Everybody's memorable in their own way. And I've had conversations with people who have seen the movie, and we talk about side characters we loved, and everybody seems to have kind of a different one. And so the acting from top to bottom is really interesting, the writing is really interesting, and the direction is incredibly impressive from a first-timer who's obviously learned a lot in her time in Hollywood. If that doesn't sound like it's appealing to you, hey, I understand, comedies aren't for everyone, but if you're at all curious about seeing Booksmart, you're not going to have the kind of experience where you're crying, laughing for 90 straight minutes. It does ebb and flow, and there's a beauty to that kind of comedy, and it is something that I think is unique and should be experienced. And if you're trying to buff up on your comedy history and trying to figure out what makes a good or a bad comedy, this isn't really the PhD thesis of comedy, but it's certainly enough to make you book smart on the subject. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. It's a pun. I hate these walk-offs.